Hello, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives. And today I'm going to try out a new way of starting the show with me just giving a little tease at the beginning, and then we play the beautiful countdown music. So with that, I'm looking forward to another discussion with our good friend David Cranmer Underdown, and we will start that right after. All right. Hello, everybody. And David Cranmer Underdown. Great to have you back. And thanks for coming back on a subsequent Tuesday. We had a great talk last week. And so I'm delighted to continue our discussions. And I don't know where they're going to go, but I do know it's going to be interesting for me. And I hope everyone else agrees with that. We got a lot of good feedback from the last show, David, and I'm always grateful to have you give me an hour of your time. So welcome, and let's dig in.
All right, sounds good.
Well, I guess where I'll start is yesterday, of course, I've been promoting my campaign called Undo the Coup, or hashtag Undo the Coup, referring to the 1963 assassination of JFK, which I say was a coup d'etat. And I've ran a poll on X, and 97% of the responders, there were 75 responders, agreed with me. Yes, it was a coup d'etat. So that's one of the burdens I've been carrying, is trying to sort out how do we get to the rest of the people and stop relying on, already elite folks to lead us here or there, to try to get a consensus among the grassroots, the real grassroots of this country, that, yeah, that was a coup d'etat, and yeah, we can't let it stand. We got to get past it. And then you made a comment to me about how, this was paraphrasing what you said, how a lot of this may have been to cover up and to keep people from looking into Joe Kennedy, the father. Well, that intrigues me, because I've studied Joe Kennedy from time to time. But I haven't put the time in to really dig into it. So let's start there. Why did you say that perhaps these Kennedy murders served a function of distracting us from Joseph P. Kennedy?
Well, the reason that I say that is because Joe Kennedy's career, the point that I look at that where the intrigue really starts is during World War I, when he was at the Ford shipyard building, Bethlehem Steel's shipyard building facility, managing that. And that, of course, is where the Electric Boat Company was building the submarines that later becomes General Dynamics. And this is where Joe Kennedy.
That's in Rhode Island, right?
I think so. It's either that or Massachusetts. I feel like it's called the Bath, or FORE, FORE. It was started by James Watson of the AT&T. He was the one that originally founded it, but or not James Watson, or maybe it was James Watson, but the shipbuilding and the submarines were, being done at this facility. And of course, Electric Boat is in Rhode Island, in Groton. But that relationship is where he meets and develops a close working relationship with FDR, who is the Undersecretary of the Navy at the time. And in England, the mirrored position is Churchill. Winston Churchill is the deputy of the Royal Navy at the time, and he's doing, of course, the petroleum deals with British Petroleum and converting the Royal Navy from coal to petroleum.
All right, so let's stop for a second right here, because as we set up your video before the show, I think it slid down so that we're starting to lose your face. Could you make
Oh
a
yeah,
little
no,
adjustment so
I
we can?
knocked the thing off. I did exactly what I didn't want to do, and I knocked it off. So I'm sorry.
That name tag is so big. I wish I could make it
Yeah.
smaller.
Okay.
But, anyway,
So okay.
thank you. Yeah, nice to see your whole face.
Okay.
Joseph P. Kennedy was working for Electric Boat
Bethlehem Steel.
or Bethlehem Steel.
They owned the shipping yard, but it was called the Fore Shipping Yard, owned by Bethlehem Steel.
And that was up on Long Island Sound somewhere, or
I thought it was on the Cape. I thought it was an old Massachusetts one. I'll have to look it up. It's
okay.
definitely in the Rhode Island, Massachusetts. It's old.
Very
Boston
close, very close to where the Navy now has the big submarine base, right?
I would expect it to be very close.
Yes.
I haven't mapped it, but I would expect them to be working historically, have a long working relationship.
Now, his background is in Joseph P. Kennedy's background is in Boston, of course, from the famous Boston Kennedy and
Fitzgerald family.
And Fitzgerald family, of course. So, how does that affect him as he enters into a relationship with FDR?
Well, so he goes on to Hayden and Stone, which is a private investment bank where he has great success with many different ventures, like the Libby Owens Ford Glass, which is a Toledo, Ohio, interesting one. And then he did was in on Hertz Rent-A-Car, which later is interesting because that's General Motors. And then he was also did RKO Pictures with David Sarnoff, and of course David Sarnoff is interesting because he's he's the president of RCA Corporation. My grandfather worked for RCA his entire career, and so I'm always very tuned into anything RCA. And of course, Sarnoff was also involved with the sinking of the Titanic. He was part of the radio crew that was giving reports from the Titanic. So there's just a lot of intrigues with, kind of big events that he's around, and the thing that I said in the message was the vacuum tube technology, and the vacuum tube was used for wireless communications. It was also used to put sound on film, and that's where a lot of the personal stories for me come in, as far as the radio and the vacuum tubes and the proximity fuse with RCA and all that stuff. That's part of his background.
And why would that be covered up?
I don't think that part is necessarily covered. I mean, the story of getting the tip from the shoeshine boy, and he sold all of his stock holdings to get out of the stock market before the crash is kind of a Warren Buffett kind of tale. The shoeshine boy, I mean, has sort of negative connotations later when you get into the Vietnam and stuff like that. But the deal that really is curious for me is the Somerset imports, and this is in 1933 when FDR becomes the president, and he joins with FDR's son Jimmy Roosevelt, and they are now managing Somerset Imports, which has basically a cartel relationship to distribute liquor and spirits into the United States legally at this point. But Jimmy Roosevelt comes up in the story, and is interesting.
I'm just looking behind the Honey Fitz story, and whether what Joe's doing is running around making investments for the mafia money.
I think so. I mean, I think the historical rivalry between the Cabot Lodge family and the Kennedys is very famous, and you can go through the three generations of political rivalries and all that. And my take on that is that I think it is a gang counter gang strategy that's being used, and that there's definite real rivalries and vendettas, but there's also collaboration where it's good for both partners. And so that's the situation. And I think it is. It's not a, Joe is a good guy and the bad people say bad things about him. It's a highly complex character that is, has those local Boston political connections, but then goes all the way to become the ambassador to England. He's on the defense technology, the very first one that was created. He was on that committee for Eisenhower, so he's in the middle of um, a lot of activities. So and also for personally, there's also the story of the rumor of the Purple Gang putting the hit on him for smuggling. And this is something that the Kennedy family, I feel like, is really trying to make a big point, that they were not involved in prohibition rum running, and then it was only the Somerset imports after prohibition was repealed. But the problem that I have is that simultaneously Joe was also the very first SEC chairman. And so if you remember the 1933 Michigan State bank holiday that leads to the federal bank holiday that leads to the, Glass-Steagall Act, and the SEC is one of the main investigative functions of the new legislation, and Joe Kennedy is the head of it, and he brings in like the William Douglas and Abe Fortas as his assistants, who become intriguers later in time. They both become Supreme Court justices.
What about covering that up is so important that it's a factor in the assassination of JFK?
So there was a man named Lee DeForest that created a vacuum tube, and it was a hotly contested patent. And this includes the Marconi Company, which their American patents became RCA. There was a Marconi scandal in England, which involved the prime minister's brother during World War I. So you have this whole Marconi, RCA. The German angle is ITT and Telefunken are the kind of the German competitors in the mix. So this is like radio and signal communication history, and so the Lita Forest is part of this. And this is the other thing, is that when Joe Kennedy is working at the shipyard and FDR is the undersecretary, the secretary of Navy is Josephus Daniels. And we've talked about him before because he's the one that had the racist newspaper in Raleigh with Julian Carr. And then he's also the person, and Julian Carr was the person that sponsored Charlie Sung, that, partnered with, Sun Yat-sen and starts the KMT. And then his kids, basically run Taiwan now, or, and that becomes the World Anti-Communist League. Chiang Kai-shek is one of the co-founders. So this is the legacy of this. And this does go back to Raleigh. This is J.B. Duke and Duke University in North Carolina. It was all started by these families. And again, it's like so hard for me because my third grade teacher's dad was the North Carolina chancellor, of North Carolina University. So, and my good friend played basketball at Duke and stuff. So like I have very favorable opinions of all these things, but that's very dark history. The Raleigh, the Wilmington massacre was a KKK, where they murdered a lot of people. It was terrible. But he then goes on to become the Secretary of the Navy with Wilson, and he's the one that brings in Thomas Edison, to create the Naval Advanced Research Projects. So for going into World War I, Josephus Daniels takes over the radio frequencies for war, for war usage, and he partners with Thomas Edison, to bring in more modern technology that the Navy can use. And this is, of course, in the period when you're going to, Ironsides, and you're going to petroleum. So there's a big shifts in the, um, the needs of a navy at this point. And Edison was the person that, was introduced to Henry Ford by Alex Dow, the guy that recruited my great grandfather, that was his neighbor and friend in Barton Hills. And that was the Alex Dow that was on the Detroit aircraft founding with Edsel Ford, Henry Ford, Charles Kettering, and William Bushnell Stout, that goes on to be Convair's chief um, engineer, which Convair then becomes General Dynamics, which goes back to Electric Boat now, because now you have the kind of that you see the history of General Dynamics from like World War One to the point where like Henry Crown takes over for the Cold War.
Fascinating, really fascinating. Now to go back to there's two competing ventures to conquer the world's market for radio communication.
Mm-hmm.
One of them is the Marconi British group, and one of them is the Telefunken German group.
Mm-hmm.
And Joe Kennedy, how does he play into this?
So he does the deal with David Sarnoff for RKO and to bring the RCA's sound to film technology. So he does that deal, and he also has the the Pantages thing, the Greek that owned all of the um, movie theaters, and he had the underage girl say that she got raped, and then she lied about it, and then Joe Kennedy bought him for 10 cents on the dollar, and then turned out he lied about it. So he, ended up buying all of the movie theater chains that became RKO.
But which
So
side of that is they on? Are they on the German side or the British side?
I don't know, because Joe, later, he's partnered with Louis Rosensteel with Shenley in 33, and then Rosensteel's the guy that Roy Cohn's doing the compromise for for J. Edgar Hoover for Meyer Lansky. So you've got the kind of the same nexus of, and again, we're talking about United Distillers, and we're talking about Seagram's, and I mentioned too the Hiram Walker. So this is the big four. Hiram Walker, his daughter married a Taxus internus, the old
Turn in
post,
Texas.
the old postman or whatever of Europe, the old, the Holy Roman Emperor's, couriers. So she married into that family, and they had this Bellagio property at Lake Como, and she was an heiress from Grosse Pointe, Michigan, and she married the, whatever Austrian prince, and that property was donated to Dean Rusk, the chairman of the Rockefeller Foundation, and that now is the Rockefeller Bellagio, retreat center, where quite a few of the Rockefeller programs, were launched. And so that's, that's why the distillery competitions is so interesting, because you get the, you get the Brofmans in the story, and then you get the and for the Irish interest, you also get the Guinness and the distillers case, and now you can go to the Lord Moyne getting assassinated in Egypt, and that conflict with his son being married to the Diana Mitford or whatever, that was the friend of Hitler, and all that. So that's part of it also.
So what you're saying is that all of these scandals that you've just told me about that I didn't know about before are dirt that they don't want discussed. And to talk about Joe Kennedy and to really examine his life would expose a lot more than you've just said. So just to try to keep him, under the radar screen when we're looking for the true history of where we're at and how we got here. Is that fair?
Yeah, it's fair. And again, when this is somebody that's operating in as an ambassador, that's going to have top secret security clearances, that is personal friends with all the heads of state and everything. So it's a he's an important character, and like I said, very complex, but is he is he toe the line between the black and gray and white? Yeah, I think he's all over the board, like most of the characters in his role.
Yeah, he comes across as an Anglophile, of course, having been, the ambassador to England,
Hmm.
and the stories about him are that he affected that high aristocratic manner, dress, and was kind of trying to blend in with the royals. So the surface appearance is, yeah, he was an Irish man that was, trying to become a courtier. He was a courtier of the royals. Uh, Now, is that just a story that we're supposed to swallow, or is it that's pretty much really true?
Well, you have to look at Kick, because Kick married into the Cavendish family, and that was the whole thing about the Cavendishes. They felt like they had a claim to the throne, and he was killed in World War II, and so was Kick, and so was Joe the first son. So there's a lot of betrayal. But my analysis is that they're in a covert network of energy deals and the just distilling, which is also gets into the pharmaceuticals and whatnot. And he's in the mix with all these things. And I think what happened was he worked with other kind of um, what the disenfranchised minority groups. So I think that because the Irish and the Italians, they were the darkies in Boston, I think was how they were referred to by the Brahmin. And I think what they did was they partnered with characters like Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano, and they had the upcoming minority groups that were in, with the elites. But again, the same Kit Kennedy's boyfriend in high school was David Rockefeller, and then she dated the God, the oh my gosh, the Grace, the guy, the head of the WR Grace company, Peter Grace was her long boyfriend. So it wasn't like they were um shunning the Standard Oil people. They were dating the kids.
That is a really important point. And I was also interested, in studying character Ross Gilpatrick. That Gilpatrick, with obviously Irish heritage, would also have. Oops, we losing Bo. Goodbye, Bo.
Sorry.
Okay,
He was, yeah.
we love Bo.
Hmm.
So I forgot where I was, but the question I think is now getting to be, um, there's a group that is fighting against Joe Kennedy in his lifetime. It sounds like the Lodge family is a large part of that.
Hmm.
And so, and it's interesting that Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. would have been the Kennedy's ambassador to Vietnam. That's very strange.
Hmm.
But so I was mentioning Ross Gilpatrick, who sounds like a good Irishman as well as Kennedy, and yet he grows up as a friend of one of the Rockefellers. I think it was David, and so this, genuine or not, trying to integrate. It sounds so much like the servitors of Dr. Hamamoto's book and and my book about how I think my dad was groomed to be a servitor. And so the question is, did Joe Kennedy manage to be independent of the the real powers that were allowing him to do all of these things in the first place? And was a decision made that him and his whole dynasty have just got to stop. And so when Jack gets elected to the presidency, that pisses him off. Uh, Bobby's attempt to become the president really pisses him off. And so it's also, there's a lot of suspicion about Joe Jr. and how Joe Jr. was sent on this crazy special mission
Mhm.
and ends up dead. So, that could have been a hit.
And you know who was the trainer that was following Elliot Roosevelt?
Oh God.
Jimmy's brother
Oh
was
God.
the training plane that saw him blow up. So, and again, Jimmy, the brother, is the second son or whatever to Joseph Kennedy and Somerset Imports, and then Jimmy is the one that gets in iOS with Robert Vesco and with Bernie Cornfield and Tibor
What's
Rosenbaum.
iOS?
What's that?
What is iOS?
International Overseas Services. And this was started by Bernie Cornfeld. It was taken over by Robert Vesco. Robert Vesco breaks into Prince Bernard's vault, the Dark Prince from the Netherlands, has to flee to the Costa Rica, then goes to the Bahamas where he sets up the Medellin cartel with Carlos Ledler and Pablo Escobar. His partner, and Vesco was the one that did the 72 campaign contributions with Donald Nixon, if you remember, the nephew of Richard Nixon. And the Bill Casey was the in the Joe Kennedy role. He was the head of the SEC, and then John Mitchell was Attorney General, and they kind of suppressed this Vesco contribution because it had Donald Nixon, which of course had the old Howard Hughes and Prescott Bush, sink on it still. So that was all part of this Watergate, and the Pentagon Papers was all layered in with that. So that's why Jimmy Roosevelt career arc going from son of the president, starting Somerset Imports with Joe Kennedy in 1933. Then by the 50s, he's in banking relationships with Meyer Lansky's main banker, Tibor Rosenbaum and Robert Vesco. And then that banking situation turns into Vesco fleeing to Cuba, and then he's in Cuba doing deals with Frank Turple in the 80s. Turple was one of the enterprise people with Iran Contra and with Ted Shackley and Ed Wilson and that whole group. So these are the players, and the thing is that Robert Vesco went to Cass Tech High School, where Andrew Marshall went to high school, where Charles Lindbergh's mom was a chemistry teacher, where Jack DeLorean went to high school there, and Daniel Ellsberg went to Cranbrook and Bloomfield Hills, and they were in the same Rand Corporation group together. And the person that started it was Horace Rowland Gaither, that we've talked about many times with this is the Rand Corporation. So we're talking about Curtis LeMay, um, Douglas or Donald Douglas, and then Hap Arnold were the founders of it. So that was the origin of it. But again, with the commonly understood history, Ellsberg is a challenger. He risks his life, as a whistleblower. He's not an insider that I think was working with McNamara when he lived in Ann Arbor, because McNamara was working for Ford and Ellsberg was working for Rand Corporation. I know he was driving the MG around Santa Monica or whatever, but and that's the other thing, is that JFK was very close with that nexus of Robert McNamara in Ann Arbor, and he was also going to Ann Arbor to meet with Walter Reuther, who was the head of the UAW, and was very influenced by Reuther. And of course, Reuther is the one we've talked about because he went to Russia to teach the Russians how to run the gas factory that Albert Kahn built, and then he came back and worked for Ford, and then he got into the UAW, and then he got in the fights with Hoffa, like Bobby Kennedy. But the problem for me is that Hoffa and Reuther are neighbors. One lives in Paint Creek, and the other one's up at Lake Orion, and so they had the big public fight. But again, you know, is it theater and a gang counter gang strategy where you have people fighting? But again, like, I don't know what happened to Hoffa, but his son went to my to Country Day and everything. So we're he got picked up at, or last seen at, the Fox and Hounds at Telegraph and Maple. So these are all like very local stories. So that I'm rambling, but that's why I place high value on Joe Kennedy and his relationships and the kind of the legacy with it. And I can explain the Charles Coughlin as a PR angle and how he ties into that as well.
I've heard you speak about Charles Coughlin a number of times. Let's go ahead and let you do that.
So the story begins with the two brothers, Edward Jewett and Harry Jewett, and they start a car company called Page Detroit, and then they buy the Lee DeForest patents that I just talked about. So these wireless vacuum tube patents go to a radio station in Pontiac, Michigan. Okay, and so they start what's called WJR radio station, and in 1926 they put Charles Coughlin on their radio station. He starts broadcasting from the Shrine of the Little Flower in Royal Oak, which is like 5 miles or whatever from Pontiac. Those vacuum tubes, or the Lee DeForest patents, then become RCA, takes those patents. This is the during the Joe Kennedy and the Sarnoff deal. And you also have to remember that the head of RCA, Owen Young, does the Young Plan that becomes the Bank of International Settlements. The reconstruction of World War I is an RCA man that's doing that deal. So the next important point is the Vatican radio in 1931, which was put on by Marconi. The person that was the assistant, the nuncio, was Pacelli, Eugenio Pacelli. His very close friend and longtime associate was Francis Spellman. Francis Spellman did the translation of the very first Vatican radio signal comm ever done. So those radio patents, and you also have to remember that Raytheon, the company that Vannevar Bush made himself, right after Tufts, was vacuum tubes originally. So all of these patents get into like all these lawsuits. There's Collins Radio. You have the Warner Brothers saying Bell Labs, they're anti-Semitic and they won't lease the patents to them. So they fake out the Frank Jewett, different Jewett family, but the head of Bell Labs gets faked out by the Warner Brothers wife. She wears a crucifix. So apparently that was the pretext, but those that Page Detroit then gets acquired by Graham brothers, and that becomes Graham Page. This deal was done by the Dillon Reed Bank that to me is so critical, but it's never talked about because this is William Henry Draper, Forrestal's a partner, Douglas Dillon's a partner, and they are doing Reconstruction World War I loans. They're loaning to Europe, they're loaning to Russia, and it's, this group is partners with, they're a part of the Goodyear Tire Company, 25% Goodyear, which is also Harriman interest. So you have that connection, and they buy Dodge from the Dodge brothers. The Dodge brothers die, and then the Dillon Reed Bank buys Dodge from the widows. They then sponsor the Graham brothers to buy the Page Detroit, becomes Graham Page. I know it's convoluted. The end of the line, Henry Kaiser buys Graham Page. He sends his son, Edgar Kaiser, from Oakland, California to Barton Hills, Michigan, to run the Willow Run factory, which is Kaiser Fraser now, because Ford was going to do a deal in Israel in 48, and the Arab League shot it down. So instead, Kaiser Fraser does it. So they take this deal from Willow Run, from Ypsilanti, Michigan, and then they basically industrialized. Said 40% of industrial output came from Kaiser Fraser. The guy that did that negotiation is Ilham Efren, who did the negotiation with Jan Masaryk, the Czech diplomat that did the Czechoslovakian war surplus. Masaryk is, after he signs this January 48 deal with Ilian and with other, the people, the military people for the Arab-Israeli war, 2 weeks later, Russia crashes into Czechoslovakia. Coup. Czechoslovakia is now a communist country. The communist, surge is crashing into Europe. So we have to have NATO now. We need an alliance. We needed a defined alliance. Jan Masaryk thrown out the window, killed. He's dead. Who takes over the account? Robert Maxwell, right? A young Czechoslovakian intelligence triple agent that just happens to be friends with the communists. He knows the commies. He can keep the deals going. You can keep the Skoda works. The Panzers can continue to flow. And Robert Maxwell is now the broker. And so Jan Masaryk is dead. Edward Benish, he dies just right after as a sad man. Who does his granddaughter, according to his family, niece, according to every publication, moved to Bloomington, Indiana, 1949, to be in the Quonset hut preschool with my mom and her friends? Eva Benish. So to me, she and her grandfather or great uncle, depending on who you believe, he was the head of the Czechoslovakian government in exile. He planned Operation Anthropod. So when Reinhard Heydrich is assassinated, who's also the head of what is Interpol now, is killed, right? Her grandpa or great uncle is the one that did that. Jan Masaryk was the protege of Edward Bernays. Edward Bernays was the protege of Thomas Masaryk, his father. This is a familial thing. He was thrown out the window. So she moved to Bloomington and is in preschool and her dad is teaching at IU. Like, to me, that is like every Nazi would be trying to find them, right? I mean, didn't they make the movie Casablanca about saving the Czech resistance fighters?
I'm speechless.
Yeah. Ava's aunt married Zbigniew Brzezinski too. So and also Joseph Korbel, the father of Madeleine Albright and the mentor of Condi Rice, was a Czechoslovakian government and exile worker for Edward Benish. He was an SOE, British intelligence during the war. And William Wiseman set up the Section 5 in New York for British intelligence, and Thomas Masaryk set up the Eastern European language intelligence at University of Chicago in the same era. So, and then he leveraged that into, negotiating with Edwin Mandel House and with what's his name, the Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, to get recognition for Czechoslovakia. So that was and also Czechoslovakia was the country that the treasury was looted by Montague Norman and Helmar Schlecht that created the BIS, again, an RCA thing. And then, of course, the RCA building is 30 Rockefeller, originally the home of the British Security Coordination and the Rockefeller Foundation. Across the street is St. Patrick's Cathedral, where Francis Spellman was, the cardinal. And it's, that's where a lot of stuff happens right there. I mean, Trump Tower's 2 blocks away. I mean, this is where a lot of, history of New York is right in the, right in Midtown, right there.
So when we see conflicts, like Trump versus Clinton, or any of the others, the competition between the patent holders, for instance, and you give me this idea that, okay, there is that competition and it's real, but it serves a higher interest, which ultimately serves the interest of both parties. So this gang versus gang strategy sounds like, that's what banks do. That's what loans are about. That's why a young person might grow up and just really want to go to that university, and goes to that university and thinks he's now going to help humanity, and he's offered an opportunity, whether it's a job or an investment in some idea that he's got, but it's going to have strings on it from that point on, and that you're drawn in to this on one side or the other or both sides, that it's all, to me, goes back to the question of, is there a single entity like that, like the successor to the Roman Empire that's sitting in London, that's, or the House of Lords, or whatever, however they pronounce it, the House of Lords. Uh, uh, so and to them, to the Ludds, the rest of us are Luddites. We don't know nothing, and we're ready to destroy our own means of production, just because somebody with a red flag says so. That picture of that ongoing empire and these real but at the same time not real uh, battles that seem so vicious in our media, and that do end up in people getting killed. I mean, it is a mortal battle at best at some point. And so you have Joe Kennedy's side in this whole thing must have really gotten on their nerves at some point, and they said, look, we're going to quash this whole regime. Nobody has a chance to ever become powerful like Joe Kennedy was. Uh, and it's all, just part of the game. Am I speculating too much here, or is that?
I mean, I think like if we're gonna talk about Zbigniew Brzezinski and the chessboard, like the gang counter gang to me is just one interaction on the board. It's not the whole game. It's just one strategy that's used in a layered, strategy where I mean, the idea, like I think a lot of what our problems are now is the um it's the IG Farben patent pool, which was so sullied by the Holocaust that nobody wants to be associated with it because of those implications. But like when when FDR was the Attorney General, he was working on the Interhandle case, which was the IG Farben in Switzerland, and there was also American IG in the United States, which had Edsel Ford on it, and Walter Teagle was on it, but also Bobby's um, father-in-law Skakel. He had the Great Lakes Carbon, which was a BASF, cutout. So there was a lot of um, the a lot of it is, I think, trying to you know pos- position all of these Nazi patents on the Nazis and say that we had the Nuremberg trials and the doctors trials and we got rid of the bad guys, but they still kind of floated that there's these rat lines, and there some people could have escaped or whatever, um but that's why I look at like the distillers and the Guinness so much, because Distillers Corporation was doing, for the British, was doing their penicillin, which was a super project for World War II. It was one of the biggest needs of all the militaries was penicillin. And they also did the thalidomide, and thalidomide was covered by this Harold Evans, who was a editor, and then he married Tina Brown, who my sister used to work with, but she was the one that, she started Talk Magazine at Hearst, and this is with Harvey Weinstein and with the guy from Sex and the guy that was the inspiration. So she
Chris,
is fascinating. What's that?
Chris something, the actor.
No, it's not him. It's the guy that inspired Candace Bushnell that wrote the story, the one that works for the newspaper that Jared Kushner and his brothers bought, the New York Inquirer or Observer or whatever, that was the Kushners bought when they were 24, and they bought that newspaper. That was she wrote the Sex and the City column, but the whole concept was based on this book by Helen Gurley Brown. So
Oh.
Helen Gurley Brown and Tina Brown, who my sister kept telling me are icons. They're icons. Like I didn't know who they were because I wasn't into feminism. I didn't study it. I didn't know who they were. I didn't know who. I kind of knew who William Randolph Hearst was a little bit. I didn't know the details, but she worked in the Hearst building and everything. But But that was very important for me because it gave me a very good insight of how the magazine publishing business works and how they use intelligence people and have these relationships that are bleed over, because the main critic of Trump right now, Michael Wolff, that's writing all the Trump books with Steve Bannon, he was on the bid to buy New York Magazine, or New Yorker, or no, it was New York, with like Robert Maxwell and with Jeff Epstein and with Harvey Weinstein, and this was in the 90s. So it's like there's so much bleed over in all these things, and then like John did the George magazine with David Pecker, who's in the middle of all the Inquirer stuff. He was with Hatchet at the time. But all these like publishing things are intriguing because like Jackie Kennedy, she I think was Newsweek or something. There's a lot of crossover between journalism and multi functions.
Oh yeah,
It's one of the
absolutely.
best roles. I mean, it's why I study War Information Board so much. The guy that ran it was the Hoosier. It was Edwin Davis from the Indy Star, the Dan Quayle's family's newspaper. That he was the head in World War II was Elmer Davis. He ran and they picked him because he sounded like a friendly neighbor from Indiana. That's why they picked him as the trusted, friendly voice of the Midwest.
War Industries.
War Information Board. So when they did the OSS, they split the OSS into operations, and then they had the information board that was doing the black and white propaganda, and
Oh,
that was they were the basically the But James Warburg, the guy that interviews Goring at Camp King, he was Max Warburg's son actually, and he was the head of the War Information Board of all of Europe for Donovan. So that's another close connection, because his cousin Eric is the one that started Warburg Pincus.
I'm back. I'm still thinking, the only way to really see this is as a whole bunch of potential courtiers trying to rise higher into the empire, and to have more influence and to have more people working for you, and to just be more of a big player, and none of this has anything to do with the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence or the Bill of Rights or the common people whatsoever. It's just there is an empire. The people that are born into it or somehow get raised into it are fighting their way higher. They just keep trying to get up higher into that pyramid. That's the only way I can analyze all of this. Your thoughts on that?
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Why do you think Jeff Bezos and Lauren Sanchez picked the Venetian Arsenal as their wedding location?
Well, of course, Venice ties together the Bezos with the Elon Musk in the Doge idea, because the Doge is the figurehead, enforcer character of the Venetian system. And the Venetian system is how the empire works. And so Venice is kind of at the heart of the empire in terms of how the rules-based order really works. How's that?
It's good. I mean, I think it's fascinating. The thing for me that stood out was that the Venetian Arsenal is supposedly where mass production was born, and that was where they created the assembly lines, and that was sort of their competitive advantage, was their ability to manufacture things at a higher rate. So that was partly, I thought, was a wink, because they say Ransom Olds in Oldsmobile, he was the one that brought the assembly line. There's kind of a fight between Henry Ford and Ransom Olds over who did the original assembly line, but that's what I think of, because Olds was also the one that sponsored all the Hudson Auto guys that became Roy Chapin, and then Hudson was owned by Queen Wilhelmina, the Dutch queen, the mother-in-law of Bernard, and then that was the merger with AMC with George Mason, and then George Mason dying, and then George Romney taking over AMC. So that's how I think of it. Is I think of the manufacturing and the history of that stuff. The thing that we didn't talk about with Joe Kennedy, which I think is so interesting with his history, was the Coughlin, getting Coughlin off the air. And why did they, they obviously they sued Henry Ford for the Dearborn Independent and for his anti-Semitic rhetoric.
Who sued him?
It was Lewis Marshall and Samuel Untermeyer from New York City, the ones that started the American Jewish Congress, and
Zionists.
Yeah, I mean, these are the like Jacob Schiff and Lewis Marshall founded AJC, which is the I mean they had from Baltimore, Louis Bluestein was doing Holocaust reparation deals, with Conrad Adenauer. So these are, and they're Amoco Oil, where Joe Biden's grandpa worked. I mean, which is now BP Amoco. So these are the big key people that are doing the, Reconstruction Marshall Plan type planning.
Okay, and so why do they not like Father Coughlin?
Well, Coughlin turned on the New Deal was the main thing, but you have to remember Detroit was the beginning of the bankruptcy, right? The Detroit Bank, Guardian Bank, was not staked. It was Henry Ford and Edsel Ford, and they wouldn't pay to, save it. So it went bankrupt, and then they had the Reconstruction Finance Committee come in and, started NBD instead. And that was, that started the bank holiday, the Michigan bank holiday, leads to the federal bank holiday. So if you're Coughlin and a lot of these industrialists that have been basically bankrupted, you would maybe be suspicious of the New Deal, because you have to remember the whole Liberty League thing and the overthrow businessmen's plot is DuPont's and Jacob Raskup, who had just broken up with Alfred Sloan because Sloan was, they fought over political differences, and Sloan was a diehard Republican guy, and Raskup wanted to be the DNC chair and build Empire State Building with the DuPonts. And so that was the whole businessman's plot. And again, this is why these stories don't wash for me. At the end of the businessman's plot, who marries the FDR Jr.? It's Ethel DuPont that marries him. So you have literally, it's like a strategic marriage, like in Europe, like in the royalty or whatever. Was that how they decided it? That, that the DuPonts and Roosevelts were going to squash the beef and marry? But Ethel ended up hung in Detroit. She died the week of her son's wedding. So, that's an heiress that had a very suspicious death. Bill Taylor actually wrote the book about that, the bathrobe, hanging or whatever. She was one of the main people. And so there's, a lot of really bad things that happen. And, my experiences is that everything was always just explained as accidents, and, bad habits and life choices, cost dearly. And so, if you don't, have in your analysis that there is a covert action and other interests at play, then those things don't make sense, and you just it's hard. I mean, I empathize with you because I feel very much similar to you in that, where it's very hard to explain things because most people just have no context or frame of reference of what you're talking about.
Well, we carry on, don't we? I think it's absolutely necessary to carry on. I just, if we don't try to get these things out, then I mean, what's the point of being here? I like life. I want everybody to have happy, long lives and enjoy nature and to not have to be drawn into these huge conspiracies, but the way the system is set up right now, and has been, clearly since World War II, is that, if you once you get done with high school, if you don't want to be a manual laborer your whole life, you're going to have to specialize in something and get specialized training and become part of some special niche. It might be even just being a plumber, but you have to work your way into the system with the unions and the existing companies and do all of that work to get to the point where you can make a living. Then you're making a living, but it's totally dependent upon your still being compliant with the existing powers that be. And the idea of somebody, just actually raising themselves up by their own bootstraps is, we've shown it many times on this. It's just a myth. I don't think you can do it unless you participate somehow in, getting loans from the big guys or having a mentor that draws you in. That's just the way it looks to me.
Well, I couldn't, talk about those kind of scenarios a lot. I mean, I feel like I've been around I feel like I was never extended, but I've heard, the stories of the guy that worked at the Franklin Racket Club and, got his first job and now is, billionaire on NBC, and his family is great. I mean, they're local, but he had, Max Fisher, liked him at the tennis club and said, if you needed something, then, look me up. So that's how I think. And that was somebody that had a situation where he had lost a parent and, financially was struggling and was, I think very similar to what you described for your dad, somebody that was really bright and a great, great prospect, somebody that you would want to have at a school like Loomis, where you can really, educate them and train them, or and I was part of that at Detroit Country Day. But you also hear of these kind of you know scenarios like that where the guy just knows him from the club and he helps him out, and next thing you know, he's got the one of the biggest uh businesses for cleaning up disaster zones or whatever. So it's these kind of things happen, but that's where I think I can be helpful is, um, you know, using my experiences, and also like, the trip to Indiana to Bloomington with my mom was very helpful because I was drove around with what I'd studied, but I was also then able to go with fresh eyes and look at all the locations and really, really lock it in where everything was and where the characters were. So that was very important for me.
Well, David, thanks for another tour of the history of our country that's very little talked about, very little known, and very crucial to understanding how we can get out of this mess. I'm blown away, as usual, by all the stuff you're able to share. And it's been a fast hour, but it's over. So I have to say thanks again, David Cranmer Underdown, for joining me here at McDuff Lives today.
Thanks so much, and happy June. Or July, sorry. End of June.
All right. Rabbit,
Okay.
rabbit, rabbit. First day of July. I know.